I am here to present on the literature review that we did with CCWT on internships. You should all have it in your hands. I think there are copies out there. But before we get started going into what the actual literature review is about, I just wanted to kind of give an audience poll. How many of you participated in an internship, either in your undergraduate or graduate experience? All right. How many of you felt generally satisfied with your internship experience and that it prepared you for the workforce? All right, so about 50-50. How many of you, if you could, would redo it and choose a different type of internship experience? All right, so not many. Just something to think about as we're going through the research that we looked at today as your own experience and what you can expect students to be having for their experiences as well. So as Matt kind of gave in his introduction, he talked about work-based learning and the issue right now of the skills gap. Right now in the politics of higher education, this is a big issue, how higher ed is aligning or not aligning with workplace needs. This is definitely something that's come up with politicians. Our own president has said that apprenticeships are going to be a big, big deal. As Matt alluded to, Scott Walker has put that in the budget that he would like all students who are completing a four-year degree within the Wisconsin system to have an internship completed. They're looking at internships kind of as a panacea to how higher ed and the workforce can align together. The issue with that, however, is that there's a difficulty in defining what an actual internship is. There's no standard definition in the research. We found all kinds of different ways that scholars and practitioners were defining internships. They don't operationalize the concept, and this makes cross-study comparison very difficult because you have different criteria that everyone is using to define an internship. One of the studies we used in the literature review was out of Portugal, and they actually included internships, apprenticeships, co-ops, practicums all together. And so that then has an issue with how you're going to go through and look through and define the research. This is also difficult for practice because it calls into question with different people what is an internship, what are students actually gaining for experience, and then how can a university or an employer actually implement a program if everyone is using a different definition. So for our literature review, we did kind of a semi-systematic partial review of the research, scholarly research. We also looked at practitioner literature, lots of how-to guides, best practices, and many, many program assessments at universities. A majority of this research had students self-report what their internship was. So again, that calls into question what is the actual internship we're looking at. And there were a lack of rigorous studies overall on internship design and outcomes. So when we're looking at potential benefit student outcomes, that's the point of the internship, right? You're hoping that students actually attain something through their time in that internship. Lots of the research that we looked at focused on student outcomes. So student satisfaction was very frequently studied. Were students feeling like they were gaining something from their internship? Employability and wage was also studied very, very frequently. This was probably what we saw the most frequently. Were students able to get a job after they did their internship in college? However, there's a lack of long-term longitudinal data. So they may look at whether or not students got a job right away out of college, but how that has then progressed on their careers over time has not been looked at. A really interesting study that we looked at came out of Oshkosh, where they actually sent in resumes, some with internship experience and some without, and they were hoping to get an idea of what, whether or not this had an effect on the students getting a job, and they did find that students with internship experience did have a higher report back or callback for their jobs. For the last two, GPA and academic persistence, career crystallization, and self-efficacy, these are also looked at. There is evidence that an internship will improve a student's GPA, and also, do internships actually help students narrow down what they want to do for a career? Is this something that improves your fit with your first job? How do you look at that? And the research is a little bit up in the air. Also, do internships help students feel that they're confident in their first job and that they're able to do their career correctly? Overall, the lack of solid definition of what an internship is makes this difficult to actually come out with student outcomes if everyone's looking at an internship in a different way. We also looked at what design characteristics of internships. There's a whole body of research that focuses on the impact of certain design characteristics. This is an important part of the research and the literature that needs to be explored more in order to actually operationalize and have a concrete definition of what an internship could potentially be. There was lots of variation on all of these and whether students actually found whether or not compensation in the internship affected their satisfaction. It did happen to be like that a lot. The duration, how long should internships be? How many should a student have? What kind of tasks are the students doing? If a student's doing something more integral to the actual company, this had an impact on whether or not they felt like the internship was beneficial. The supervisor role, very critical in making sure that students are having feedback opportunities and self-assessment mechanisms as well. Additionally, the coordination between educators and employers was also seen to be potentially critical for whether or not a student felt like they were able to connect with their academic needs and with what they're doing in college. So finally, in the literature review, you can reference this as well. We left with recommendations for designing programs. This whole list is here, again, also in the literature review. But most importantly, we found that there was a lack of standards for overall internship quality, and that needs to be addressed. Legal issues and ethical concerns also are important, and that is not being shown in the literature or being talked about. Also, there need to be adequate resources for both universities, educators, employers, everyone, in order to make a large-scale internship program work. If there isn't coordination, this can be very difficult, and it detracts from the quality of the internship. The next steps, what we're doing at CCWT, is we're going to look at a mixed methods study, trying to document what internship characteristics lead to beneficial outcomes. So what are the actual characteristics in the internship that are helping students have a beneficial result with their time there? We're not sure what institution this will be at yet. Likely will be a survey and focus groups, but we really want to focus on students who want to participate in internships but aren't able to. What is preventing them from being able to do that? And what could we do to better help those students?
I have a degree in math teaching from Edgewood College, and last May in 2016 I graduated with my associates in accounting from Madison College. 3 years ago I was diagnosed with dyslexia and autism spectrum disorder. I currently do payroll for a restaurant accounting firm in Madison, and I also tutor dyslexic children at the Children's Dyslexia Center. So how I found out about my internship at Madison College was right before my last semester. One of my accounting instructors came around to our classes and told us that there was this opportunity to be part of an internship, and it was actually a class as well as the internship. So I filled out my application, and he sent it out to many different companies who were looking for interns. And after a couple weeks, the owner of Liberty Tax on Park Street said he was interested in having me come in for an interview. So I came in for an interview, and they offered me the position at Liberty Tax. And as part of the class, that we had about 8 of us doing internships, and we met about 4 or 5 times throughout the semester. And we talked about what was going on in our internships and got feedback from our classmates. We had different jobs, agencies come in and talk to us. And so that was really helpful. Also, at the end of the internship, we evaluated our experience, and our boss or the person we were working for evaluated how we did. And the instructor of the internship class, your boss, and you met for an exit interview. And so your internship bosses also gave advice on what, how you did and other things like that. So I ended up going to career counseling because I found out I had to do an interview, and that's definitely not my strength. So I scheduled a meeting with the career counselor, who's actually my disabilities resource coordinator when I started. And so some of the help I got was preparing for my interview, being able to do mock interviews with multiple different career counselors, both in person and doing phone interviews, learning different techniques like the STAR technique, and the hand technique for remembering 5 things about you, and just getting tips on what to wear and the interviews. And the skills that I learned from career counseling definitely helped me get my job that I have today. So my internship experience, I learned a lot of communication skills because I prepared taxes for small companies, individuals, low-income people. So just learning how to make phone calls to customers, both current and previous, and doing that in the right way. Customer service, just learning how to greet people when they come in, learning how to answer questions, and also learning how to use some new tax preparation software. And another thing that my internship boss made sure I did was learning how to use resources available to me to answer my questions first and not just asking him for the answer. So that was helpful. And I think for me, my internship experience was good because it was in my field area, so it made a big difference. And I think some of the struggles of the internships were knowing that where I was placed would not lead to a job offer because it was a seasonal place, and because I was the only one with that internship position in my class, whereas the rest of them were at accounting firms. So being confident with my abilities, because I was really nervous at first. And in my exit interview, my boss said, "You looked really nervous," and I didn't know if it would be a fit. But in the end, he really liked me, and I actually still work with him during tax season. I'll be going back for my 3rd tax season and working on Saturdays. So just keeping up that experience. So. And my advice, I would recommend that all students complete an internship specifically in the area that they're getting their degree. And to know that the experiences you will gain from doing your internship will help you with your future jobs. About 3 months after I started at my job, my boss told me that the reason I got this position was because I had an internship and because of the training I received at Madison College. So, also, my advice would be to take advantage of career counseling services at your university or college, because through career counseling you will be much better prepared for interviews, and they can also help you with job searches and looking for jobs that will fit you. And and also you can continue to take advantages at most universities of career counseling once you graduate. I still go back if I need to and get help. I would also tell students not to give up on an internship just because, it may not lead to an immediate job offer. And doing an internship is just one more thing you can put on your resume, and it shows that you have workplace experience. And then if you have a learning difference like me, it's even more important that you do an internship and to help you improve your communication skills and build your workplace skills. So.
Working on the internship subcommittee here on campus and with international internships, it was really exciting to read this literature review because I felt like it reinforced so many of the discussions that we have in our committee and with colleagues across this campus. So if you haven't read it yet, I'd really encourage you to do so because it really does a good job summarizing a lot of the challenges that we've grappled with. And kind of piggybacking on what Samantha was focusing on with definition, even when you're just looking at this campus, trying to come up with a definition for internship is extremely difficult. We spent about 3 years on the internship subcommittee trying to work on ideas for a policy to have a course attribute to identify coursework that went along with internships and workplace experience. And we had to go back and forth just trying to come up with some basic things we could agree on across this campus and some definitions. We used workplace experience to define it because we were using different terms to define overlapping types of experiences. So thinking about that and trying to take that to the state or to different institutions, that even within this institution, there's so much difference between disciplines and the additional criteria that we each might have beyond what we could agree on as a campus, just shows how challenging the definition is. When you're trying to say this is for everyone, it's really not one thing. And the self-reporting challenge is a big issue too. And we try to think about how do we capture more data, how do we get more information? When you're relying on self-reporting and inconsistent understanding, that's really hard. So for example, when we talk to students, often we'll start workshops saying like, what is an internship to you, or what do you think that means? And a lot of students will agree on some basics, like they'll understand that there's learning, there's training involved, you'll have a supervisor, they can kind of highlight some of the things we think are important. But then when you drill in, they really have a lot of different beliefs about internships depending on their own backgrounds and experiences. We've heard students who will say it has to be unpaid. And like that's just, for them, that's what an internship is. And for other students, maybe they'll think it has to be paid. And so that's a really big challenge to deal with, is what are the students' preconceptions coming into seeking out an internship opportunity as well. And then working with international internships, we have the added challenge of we're not just looking at the US context, but internationally. So every country we work with might have different definitions, and then working with students on how to deal with that and some of their expectations on where they can do an internship, what an internship will look like where they want to go. So for example, in Japan, where I work with a lot, a domestic internship for a student might be only 1 to 2 weeks, and it's really focused on shadowing. But when we have an international intern coming in, they don't want 1 to 2 weeks, they want 3 months or 6 months. And so trying to get something that's mutually beneficial and that both sides can get something out of and will work for students is a really big challenge for setting expectations. So then with my program too, we're a small program, we're super hands-on with students and organizations in defining these internships and working on them. And even with those close relationships and being hands-on, we can't control for everything, and student experiences vary a lot. But by being small and having this really high-touch advising, we do at least know that we can help them navigate and process challenges that they come across. But when you think of someone just doing it and the employer and the student have different expectations and nobody's helping coordinate that, that's going to look a lot different than a small scale. So our challenge then is scaling. So we're only reaching maybe 130 students on this campus a year. If we want to reach more, how can we do that? What would that take? And looking at that as a really big challenge. There aren't many schools that run international internship programs like we do here. It's really only a handful. Most rely on program providers. So those are usually fee-based programs that you pay. They might be for-profit or nonprofit, but you pay them to find your internship. And those internships are usually unpaid. So you're paying someone to find you an unpaid internship. And that's on top of attending a university and tuition. And some of these programs might be really great and have a career development focus and be really hands-on, but they're not all equal, and it's really hard for students to navigate that. And the majority of these programs do transfer the cost to the student. So it's not the employers investing in it. It's not the university helping to coordinate it. The student is paying extra to have this experience. So that's a really challenging model that we've tried to avoid with our program. But when we talk about scaling, that's pretty much how universities have scaled internship programs, is using these fee-based, often for-profit companies. Whereas we focus on internships that do offer compensation. So we have about 50% of the internships we development have some form of compensation, and those are really high in demand. And a lot of students are really reluctant to seek out some of these fee-based opportunities, and for good reason. But there are some countries and locations where it's almost impossible to do it without one of these organizations. So that's a really hard challenge to kind of grapple with when you're thinking about scaling and quality. And I've increasingly seen some of these fee-based programs working in a US context now as well. So some of them are focusing on international student population, placing them in internships in US cities, and increasingly US students too, who feel that they can't do it on their own, and these programs give them more support. So again, some do it really well, but it's a really big and not very well regulated field. I was talking to one of these providers recently actually, and they said they get more and more students who say they have to have an internship. It has to fit certain goals of their university. And they've been grappling with how do they work with their local partners to fit these definitions that don't mesh together well. So they're working in developing countries, and they're being told, oh, the student has to have this much supervision or this much hands-on work. And like their local teams are just strapped and can't necessarily meet that. They're trying to fit into this mold of all these different universities telling them different things of what an internship is. I've even heard volunteer programs saying that they're getting told it has to be an internship, not volunteer. And they're having to walk that line of well, what makes it an internship and not volunteer, and what does a university or a student expect from that? So this is definitely within the international a growing area of expansion and concern. And then we also hear from students too who come to our program saying they don't want to apply for a job yet because they haven't had an internship and they're not ready for a real job until they've had the internship. And so trying to get them to step back and look at what their other opportunities are is a big challenge too. We get a lot of seniors who come to us when we're really trying to focus on younger students getting these experiences earlier. So yeah, I feel like you see the greater value when the internship host and employers and students are talking to each other, are talking about purpose, are working towards some of the same purposes and values, and scalability and funding are just huge, huge barriers. Paying for an unpaid internship automatically excludes a lot of students. And so thinking about how can these be compensated, how can employers buy in, how can universities support students to do this, and validating the diversity of experiences students are having, and how those can lead to next steps as well. So I think there's a lot of assumptions about what this might be, or a lot of oversimplification, and it's really complicated, both in the domestic setting and looking abroad.
I wanted to provide a little context because I come from a technical college. So one of the things that struck me in the report is there was a line about we may be entering the era of internships, and I could not agree more. So I've been in my role at Madison College in Career Services for about 4 years. And about 3 years ago, it struck me that we were getting so many calls from employers and students wanting help in supporting internship programs. At the college, it's very decentralized, and it's mostly run through faculty. So the example that Kimberly shared is actually pretty common, that a faculty member would be coordinating the experience, they're outreaching to the employers, so on and so forth. But at the college, we needed kind of a central clearinghouse to intake some of these questions and to provide basically a subject matter expert. So at that time, I looked at some grants and found some dollars to hire an internship specialist so we could start to wrap our arms around what does this mean at the college and how can we better understand what we're already offering. And she's here today, so shout out to Amber. We both wore our Badger red. I hope you noticed that. So the very first thing we did was an environmental scan at the college of what is already done with internships and what are the different structures, how are students learning, what more support can we offer. And what we found is we have about 140 programs at the college. About half of them have an internship opportunity, whether that's required, whether it's an elective, or whether it's you kind of do it on your own type of opportunity. So some points that are important for me to share today. First is that internship design really needs to have flexibility, particularly at a two-year campus where, right now about a third of our students work full-time. So to find the time to incorporate an internship component could be challenging. At a campus where about a quarter of our students are first generation, the access to social capital and the support necessary to contact employers and kind of find these experiences is immense. And you think about students with disabilities and other things. So that support structure is very important, but also the flexibility to know, one size fits all approach is not going to meet all the student needs. Another important point I want to highlight, which my colleagues have already said, is that definition piece is so important. So we have the gamut of workplace experiences. We have apprenticeships, we have co-ops, we have clinicals. But what I'm finding is the catch-all term is internships, and we don't have a consistent definition for that. So a good example, just yesterday, a faculty member contacted my office and was concerned about some liability with a student they have already working in the field, doing an internship. And so one of the first questions we asked him was, do you have an agreement? Do you have a contract with the employer that outlines any of the liability concerns? And he didn't have that in place quite yet. But there's a ton of liability issues when it comes to internships. And so having that practical expertise on campus to not run every internship component, but to be a subject matter expert and provide some guidance is important because there's a lot of risk involved for institutions, for employers, and for students. And I think at the crux of that is defining first and foremost what we mean when we say internships.
We've gotten the opportunity to hear about a lot of the potential benefits that internships have to offer, as well as complicating the idea of what is an internship, how do you have a successful internship, right? So it's much more complicated than what it may seem at face value. And so I wanted to pose a question to the panel regarding potential policies, educational policies in Wisconsin. So as you might know, Governor Walker has discussed including a requirement for an internship or some sort of work-based learning as a requirement for a bachelor's degree from the UW system. So we've talked about how internships can be great and a lot of people are looking for good internships. But we've also talked about that it's not necessarily this very easy, simple system, right? So I wanted to get your thoughts on such a policy. Should we be thinking about those as requirements for degrees? Should we not? Why or why not? And if so, what would that look like in practice?
We have a few degrees here already that do have it as a requirement. So like School of Human Ecology over there, they already have that as a requirement. And there are, I was on a tour and got to go to dairy science yesterday. They have it as a requirement as well. So it already is happening, but it's in specific areas. And I think those are also smaller areas. Like School of Human Ecology is a smaller college. And so when you think of it, I think it comes back to scaling. When you're thinking of how do you do this, you've got to come to a definition that people can agree on, whether that's program by program, and how are you going to require it. So right now on campus, like the thing that we've been able to track better and come up with some basic policy on is 4-credit internships. And if you're making it part of the degree, I think that has to be part of it. But then to scale it, you've got to look at who's teaching these classes, who's vetting the internships, who's approving them to go into that, because that is a huge amount of time. My program does that. A lot of our students are doing it 4-credit abroad. And the time to say, like, yes, this meets our requirements and fulfills it, and then the follow-up, like the liability issues, the helping students through challenges, that is just such a huge amount of time. So to think about scaling it to some of these bigger programs, and then thinking about what an internship means for those programs and how do you get it for all students and make it accessible for all students, especially if they're going to be unpaid in a field, then you've got to think about scholarships and funding and everything to spread that out to everybody. So not really a good, here's how you do it, but those are some of the things to think about.
My thought when it comes to policy of that type is it would be very expensive to do well. So having those structures in place ahead of time would be extremely important. And Michelle was alluding to that. The advising support a student needs to be successful can be intensive. The other point I would share is any time, at least at Madison College, we found when a requirement is put in place, it could be a possible touch point where a student stops, so drops out. So a good example at our college was our IT programs actually do require an internship. We were looking at data about 3 years ago through our Perkins Career and Technical Education grant, and we're finding students were actually jobbing out, which is a good thing for the student. It meant they had the skills and the abilities to get a job, but they weren't completing their degree. And one of the things that was holding them up is this internship component. The faculty realized that, made some changes and created some flexibility in their programs to adapt. But for a policy perspective, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Of anytime you require something, there are snowball effects of that.
My internship was paid, and since it was for credits, one of the things that my instructor made sure is that we were paid enough to cover the cost of our credits. And that was our compensation. And there was a minimum, we had to make a minimum of $9 an hour. And it had to be enough to cover the cost of what we were paying to be in the class. And so that's how they worked it out with our internship people.
When we're thinking about internships, we need to think about sort of the cultural capital. We may have used a different term to think about how do we make internships sort of equitable. I would equate that to thinking about internships as being ethical. Can you speak to either, I haven't had a chance to look at the literature review, either in your own anecdotal experience at MATC, how or what differences, if any, have you observed in internship access for different demographics of students?
So my experience is that for internships and employment in general, it's the same. So there are some specialized programs in place. One that we participate in at the college is a summer affirmative action internship program. So it's a Wisconsin State internship program for students of color, women, underrepresented populations. So there are those kind of isolated programs, if you will. But I think to do it at scale, it's the resources again. So the advising or the faculty available to really help support these students and walk them through the process, both the student, but then doing actual placement with the employers. And that would apply to first-generation students, students with disabilities, anybody that may not have access to that level of placing themselves. Does that answer your question?
And I would add to that too that so with international internships, we often talk to students about 3 routes. So we develop internships for students that they can apply to that are just for Badgers. So that's one good place to start, but there's not enough of those for the demand we have. Some students find their own and then come back to us for support, and that takes the social capital to do that and have those connections. But some students, when you hear that's an option, they're like, great, I can do that, no problem. And some students hear that and you just see them like freeze and go like, not gonna happen. And then those providers that you pay for that do it are kind of filling that gap. So you have to be able to afford it, but they're doing everything for figuring out the housing and the visa and finding your internship. So you're often paying to make up for that lack of social capital, which is sometimes not possible. So when you think of those tracks too and scaling it, how do you make that more accessible? How do you increase the advising support and the development support so that students don't have to fall into those different pots?
I would just say too, from a literature standpoint, that there's very, very, very little research. When we first started looking at developing what we wanted this literature review to look like, that was something we really wanted to focus on, was how is this accessible for all kinds of people? And we had a very, very hard time finding any conclusive information anywhere. And so that's something that with the next projects that we're working on to hope to look at and think about and make it so that, you know, it's something that if it's going to be a requirement, how can all students fully participate and make this a meaningful experience?
For somebody contemplating a career in theoretical physics, they hardly would need an internship for other purpose than to see whether the match is a good match, employee-employer. And with this respect, I think it's important to see, again, going back to social justice issues, what is the purpose of an employer offering an internship? Is it really to see whether there's a good match, or to exploit people otherwise qualified, but they are not willing to put the proper payment full-time and so on? And can you comment on the similarities and or differences between internship and apprenticeship?
Apprenticeships are much more regulated by either unions or the field itself, and folks are paid while they are doing the work. The education is kind of on the side, and it's very limited. So, for example, at Madison College, if a student is in, let's say, a steam fitting apprenticeship, they're working 40 hours a week, and they're taking maybe, I don't know for certain, so don't quote me on this, but they're in class maybe 3 hours. It's much more limited because you're learning on the job. An internship, while we don't have a set definition, is a complement to your education. So it's not necessarily paid, it's not necessarily well structured. And so those are the main differences in my mind. Lots of structure, potentially little structure.
And I think the payment issue too comes back to like getting that employer buy-in. Like you were talking about, are the employers in this to exploit someone? And I think you run that risk a little more with an unpaid, as it's very low risk for the employer to do that. So getting the employer buy-in, whether that's that they have to work really closely with the university, or that they're paying, or they're doing something, gets them to see that investment on a different scale too. And to the point of internships not being a good fit for some fields, I think thinking about what research is, like a lot of time research and internships are seen as completely separate things, but for some fields, research experience in a lab is your internship. Like that's that's what you need. You don't need to necessarily go out into industry. So thinking about what that looks like too.
I'm interested what is the differences or demand and supply for, what are sometimes called non-traditional students, so like older students with work experience who are not really, they're very common, they're not non-traditional. Is an internship different for them? Like, are they interested in them, are they not? What does that look like?
Some returning adult learners might be interested in an internship because it's providing social access to social capital down the road. So it's a great way to get connected into the field. Others may be working already in the field and are coming back to get a degree and may not need an internship. A big thing I think we see at Madison College is a focus on core workforce skills, sometimes referred to as soft skills. So what we see with returning adult students is they have less of a deficit sometimes in those areas if they've already had experience working. So I guess how I would summarize is it's what is the purpose? So if they need some experience in the field, then I would see them interested. If they have a lot of experience, then I've seen that they're not they see it as like a checkbox that they may or may not want to do.
Would a student teacher practicum be considered an internship? If so, a lot of the programs that are offered through the universities do include that type of training. If not, then how do you then make that distinction?
When we first came around it, we're saying, we're looking at internship courses. Education was at the table and said, can't use that word, not comfortable with that word. Like what we're doing is still field work, it's placements, it's practicum, student teaching. So that was incorporated into, that's why we landed with workplace experience when we're looking at what is campus doing to engage and train students on site. That's why we wanted to take that broader look and not limit it to that word. So at least on this campus, that's how we tried to. Education was very vocal in immediately moving away from internship because they felt that didn't fit the student teaching model, and same with nursing for clinicals and clinical rotation, that if we're reporting on this on campus, we want to include those as workplace experience and not be looking so single-mindedly at internships to the exclusion of those types of experiences.
The research brief on page 6 has a nice table of the different definitions of work-based learning, so check that out. A similar example would be co-ops are common in engineering or STEM-based fields, and it's work-based learning, has some similarities to internships, and this is, again, highlighting where a clear definition, I think, would really be helpful, particularly if we were going toward policy.
So often, by default, a non-traditional student is one defined as one who has some work experience. That is why they're non-traditional. So I find it interesting to think about what an internship is for them, if only because it might expose some of the complexities of internships. So you mentioned how for students, which totally makes sense, it becomes a bureaucratic check mark issue. What about on the employer side? What is the perception of a non-traditional student in the internship market from the employer side?
Both here and at MIT, I had non-traditional students going abroad for internships, and so also bridging the cultural gap of that. And especially sending a student to Japan, it was a really big challenge, and that we had to actually, he and I sat down and worked a ton on his application materials to get him to that next step, to not have them focus on the fact that he was much older than they were expecting. So I think, the employer expectation when they think internship, I think a lot of them are thinking like 18 to 22-year-old, they're coming in with certain expectations, and often having the university involved to advocate for and help students bridge that gap, I think is necessary, because they may say, oh, we don't want them. But then others, again, case by case, like some will say, oh, great, they already bring this wealth of experience, we do want that. But in the case of getting this one student to Japan, it was trying to get him to that interview stage so that they would see the value, even though someone working outside of the traditional education schedule was very much out of the norm.
Some of my experience as an adjunct instructor teaching like the gen ed courses at two-year colleges, many of the non-traditional students, they were folks, re-entering schooling, in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. They were changing careers. So in other words, all of their experience was in something else. Now they're working on an associate's degree. And so I was curious, because some of them, just anecdotally, I would hear them complain in my writing class, like, well, no one wants to bring me in, I'm too old. They would just kind of complain, some people write about it. So my question is, for a non-traditional student who's switching job fields, what's the internship or, you know, or whatever phrase you want to use. Is there any research on that, or does anyone kind of feel what's happening out there?
The average student age at Madison College is 29. So this idea of non-traditional student always makes me giggle a little bit, because then all of our students are technically non-traditional. So what is non-traditional? I forgot where I was going with that. Again, I don't have any research that I'm aware of, but we work with a lot of dislocated workers in our office. We have a Workforce Investment Innovations and Opportunities Act grant within my unit, and those folks want opportunities and part-time work, internships, whatever, so that they can build their resume, build their skills, so they have a foot up when they are about to enter the labor market. We serve, right now we have about 50 students on our caseload that were dislocated from Kraft, Oscar Mayer, and many of them are they were working in a manufacturing sector and are now transitioning into something completely different. IT, healthcare, human services, you name it, it's across the board. And for them to show they have those transferable skills, the education is important. But I think where they're going to have a leg up is they have a lot of really good work history, and while it may not be in that field, they can still rely on that as they have the soft skills to be successful.
I went back to Madison College when I was 29, and I switched to accounting. And had I not had my internship experience, I don't think I would have gotten the job, because, yeah, I have a lot of work experience, but not in the accounting field. So for me, when I was deciding to change careers, doing the internship gave me the experience in my new field. So
I would just say from a research point of view, that was something that based on the articles that I encountered, I hardly saw anything at all. I mean, Matt could probably say more, not really, but lots of the scholarly articles that are written are, in a way, sort of program assessments, specifically focused on certain areas like business schools or things like that, and they're looking at undergraduate students or traditional age students in that sense.
In your perspective as students or as coordinators and administrators, some of your reflections on effective curriculum and instruction in the classroom to support students doing internship, either in a class that's accompanying an internship or in classes earlier in an academic career before a student goes for a career field experience?
my class met 4 times, and we basically talked about our internship experience. We had to answer discussion questions each week. So they ranged from, we always had to answer, what did we do during our week at our internship? What problems did we have? Were there any concerns? Another thing that was really supportive is that our instructor visited us at our internship location to see how things were going. We had to have our resumes reviewed. Actually, Amber reviewed all our resumes. We also had different job agencies, like Baker Tilly came, Robert Half, I think that's that one, and a bunch of other ones came and talked to us about how their process works finding jobs, and as well as doing the exit interview with our internship boss. And as far as on the job, they had asked our supervisors to make sure that we got feedback from them, and so we weren't just there to work, but we got feedback. So doing it as part of a class was a really great experience.
So I teach a section of our class for students who are doing internships abroad, and we actually purposely have it cross-disciplinary. So we have engineers and ag students and human ecology students and students working in government, like all sorts of different ones together, so that they're looking at work across cultures, but they're also getting exposed to all these different fields. So that's actually really interesting for me working with my group, in that you will see students get excited about fields that they don't know anything about yet. So they're not just learning about their internship, but they're also being like, wait a minute, I really want to try research next year. So I enjoy that model, but I think there are a lot of different models on this campus that work really well. When you are discipline specific, you can really dive deeper into like, what are the agencies, what are the resources for getting into this field. You can do a lot with those classes, and I think one of the benefits I really see in the students I work with who do it for credit is that even those ones who had what would be called a negative internship experience or not a good fit, they often, by the end of it, through kind of the discussions and the processing and the peer support and the instructor support, often will come to a place where they see what they did get out of it, even if they have some reservations or regrets about the specific internship they did, that by the end they're able to talk about it and process it in a way where you can see that, like, that nuance of, you know what, like, this was really hard, or I really hated this, or I learned this wasn't the field for me, but I got these transferable skills, or I worked on my resume, or I talked to people and got ideas about what to do next. Like, that support system kind of helped them make it better, even if it wasn't the ideal situation.
So from a curriculum perspective, two things. One, I would listen to industry, and someone had offered this. So in physics, it might be very different than what supervisory management might want. So listen to your industry folks, what they're telling you, and then my second point is to measure those things. So we have some like technical and industry skills the students are expected to gain. We also are working really hard to help students to develop their soft skills or their workplace skills. So I would want to make sure in the curriculum that that is assessed. We do an employer survey every 3 years, and time again, communication skills, ethical decision making, self-management, things like showing up on time. So as students are maybe getting grades or assessed as part of an internship through a class, I want to see that those things are part of the assessment and the discussion to help the student really grow.